Now, I know most of you have already started your reading, your subject-specific reading in earnest, but today we're going to talk about the nitty-gritty in terms of a literature review. So let's jump right in. First of all, let's talk about why one does a literature review in any kind of research. Well, first of all, the researcher must learn from previous theory on the subject. You must be able to comment on how your subject has been studied previously. Further to this, you also have to show that your work is adding to the understanding of the knowledge within the field. Already at honors levels, you should be able to tell how your study contributes and adds to, supplements the literature. Very importantly, however, a literature review is done because you are contextualizing your study within your field. And the best way to sort of think about this is to imagine your study and the specific research that you're going to be doing as a seed. Then think about literature as soil. Now, in order for a seed to grow and prosper into something worthwhile, it has to be put into the soil. So you're contextualizing your study in terms of the greater discipline in order for your study to grow within that discipline. Lastly, you are also showing that you have done your scientific due diligence. The aspects that you comment on, that you discuss, and that you eventually put over to findings aren't just thumb-sucked. They come from the specific scientific research already done within the subject area. So that's broadly why we do a literature review. So now that we understand why we do it, where does one really start when it comes to a literature review? Well, in terms of this presentation, we're going to be focusing on the three main phases of a literature review. The first phase is reading, reading, reading. And I can't overemphasize this. The reading part of a literature review is arguably the most important part of it altogether. But it takes a lot of time, a lot more time than you might think. And because you're reading, you don't necessarily have something to show for it. So it feels as if it's a tedious task that just never ends. However tedious it might be, it is extremely important for your study. As examiners and as lecturers, it's very easy to see right off the bat when a student has done their due diligence in terms of reading and when they have not. You can't really fake that aspect of a study. You either did your reading and you have a deep theoretical understanding, or you don't. So the first phase of a literature review is really just to read, and read some more. The second phase is where you collaborate what you've already learned, you integrate it in terms of your sources and in terms of your own study, and then you summarize everything that you read. Lastly, you write up your literature review. Now, please note over here that the writing part comes after the reading and the collaborating, integrating, and summarizing part. So don't start writing before you really have done the first two steps. Now, in terms of this, let's have a look at what the read phase of a literature review entails. Now, literature review starts off very broadly, and you read everything that you can find on it. So your reading starts out very broadly, and then it becomes more and more specific as you focus in on the aspects that are applicable specifically to your study. Now, you can't know what the specific aspects are that are going to be applicable to your study until you've done the broad reading. So, always in an academic situation, we say you start by reading undiscriminately. You read everything that you can find on the topic, and you don't focus in too much. That only comes in later when you start to become more specific in your reading. Okay, so what should you be reading? Well, first of all, you should select only academic literature. And if you have a problem with getting hold of or selecting academic literature, look at the video that I posted at the beginning of the year about using Google Scholar and the UNISA library. Then you should be reading to build a theoretical foundation. So you should be focusing on those aspects that give a foundation to your research specifically. You should be reading recent articles. Those are articles published between 2005 and now, so between 10 to 11 years, unless they are seminal works. When they are seminal works, you can date back as far as you want to, but all other literature should not be more than 10 years old. You should also be exhaustive in terms of your reading, and this is a very important aspect that ties in with the fact that you will be reading broadly and right down to specifically. If you are exhaustive in your reading, this means that you have read everything that is absolutely necessary for you to read in order to construct a good literature review. Now, of course, it's not possible to read absolutely everything ever written on the topic, but it is very much possible to read until the point of theoretical saturation. Now, the point of theoretical saturation is when you reach a point where no new information is gleaned from new sources, which means everything that you read only just repeats what you've already learned. You've reached theoretical saturation. So read and read and read until the point of theoretical saturation. That's how you know you are exhaustive in terms of your reading. Also, very important, when you start out in terms of your broader reading, you need to scan your documents because you won't be able to read absolutely everything in earnest. So, quick little tip that I always offer my students is read the abstract of articles and read the conclusion. Because in the abstract and in the conclusion, the most pertinent aspects of that article will be highlighted. And you'll be able to glean from that whether or not this article is something that you want to go ahead and read from the beginning to the end. Only if you find something that is applicable, or interesting, or noteworthy in the abstract and in the conclusion do you go then and read the whole article from cover to cover. Also, another tip that I always offer students is that you have to record your references as you read, just because I know from experience that although you think you're going to remember where your sources come from, you honestly don't always. So just it doesn't have to be a complete or a 100% correct reference list. Just make sure that somewhere you keep tabs on what you're reading and what information comes from which source. Lastly, be sure to make notes. If you read, you think you're going to remember everything that you picked up on, but nobody does. Because you're going to be reading so much, you're going to be forgetting what you read right at the beginning of your broader reading. And it might be something that becomes important to your study. So you can make notes however you want to, but I'll quickly show you how I make notes. Also, just to show you that we practice what we preach. And here's how I make notes. So I print out my articles and I highlight them, and right at the top I remind myself what the theory is. This is contingency theory, and what are the main things that the article that I'm looking at that moment focuses on. So it's critique or it's background to the study or whatever. Point is, I make some notes along the way. All right, so that's in terms of phase 1, the reading. Now let's quickly look at 3 points that you should not do, things to avoid. First of all, you have to avoid long quotations in your literature review, because direct quotes should always be kept to a minimum. So although when you are reading, you will be keeping tabs on good quotations, just the whole time while you are reading, remember that these long quotations should never make it into the final draft of your literature review. That's because you're going to be interpreting what you've read, but a little bit more about this later on. You should never provide insignificant information just to make up pages. Rather elaborate on the relevant points in terms of a literature review. Lastly, using only one or two authors in the same section is to be avoided. This shows that you haven't really searched enough for enough sources, and your reading and theoretical depth is not where it should be. If you read as much as you should in this first phase of your literature review, you will have more than one source to integrate in all of the sections that you present. And we'll talk a little bit more about integrating sources a little bit later on, but this is something that you need to keep in mind in this first phase of your literature review. Good, now that's reading done. Let's look at the second phase of your literature review. And the second phase is the collaboration, integration, and summarization phase. In this phase, it's very important to see the links in your literature review with the rest of your study. In Tutorial Letter 101, we tell you that Assignment 3 is extremely important to the whole project because the methodology, the measuring instruments in particular, and the empirical part of the study are dependent on a solid literature review. So let's look at why we say that. Well, I made you a little bit of a graphic to show you how a literature review is embedded into each and every part of your study. Okay, so let's zoom in on this model over here and look at each part of it specifically. First of all, you will see from literature, you glean theoretical statements from the theories and models and general literature that you consulted. Your theoretical statement then gives way to concepts, abstract, latent variables that you will be investigating in your study. Now, these latent variables or concepts are made up of smaller latent variables that are measurable, and these are known as constructs. Now, these constructs are the variables that you will be testing in the empirical part of your study. Of course, these constructs have to be measured in terms of the empirical measuring instruments, and these measurements give way to answering the research questions or sub-problems that you formulated, and all of these together, of course, answers your main research problem. Now let's move a little bit forward and look at the last part of the literature review process. And we're going to be talking about everything that we also saw in the second phase, which is integrating and summarizing. Okay, in terms of writing up your literature review, there's a few things that I want us to focus on. And the three main aspects that I really want to zoom in on is, first of all, integrating sources, which we already touched upon previously, making the theory applicable to your study, and line of argumentation. So let's focus in on the first one over here, integrating sources. Integration of sources is taking two or more sources together when you make your point or make your discussions in your literature review. Now, let's have a look at some examples. So we have an integration of sources over here because we have the first source over here and then the second source over here. And we link or integrate these sources through what we say. And what we say over here is that Rhodes and Barker reverberates the sentiment as displayed in Machiara. Okay, so that's one way to integrate sources. The other way to integrate sources, and I'm sure you've come across this various times in your reading, is where you have a sentiment that is displayed by more than one source together. And when all of these sources say the same thing, we then reference that thought to all of them. We separate the sources out by a semicolon. Okay, so that's integrating sources. Let's now look at making the theory applicable to your study. Now, you cannot just regurgitate what is already stated in theory, in literature, because nobody really wants to see a literature review that's just a summary of everything that you've read. If an examiner wants to read the literature, they'll read the original literature. They don't just want a summary from you. What they want from you is applying an application of the theory to your research specifically. You have to say how everything that you read and that you are commenting on in your literature review is applicable or important to note in terms of your research context specifically. Lastly, let's have a look at line of argumentation. And in terms of line of argumentation, let's look at paragraph progression. So let's start off by thinking what a paragraph is. A paragraph is a collection of related sentences dealing with a single topic. Now, through your paragraphs, you progress a single, uninterrupted, coherent argument, an academic argument that is pushed forward paragraph by paragraph by paragraph. You should never have a list of facts in your literature review. You should have a coherent discussion. It's very important to note. So let's stand still on that for just a second and we look at these paragraphs. First of all, I want us to talk about adequate development, then unity, and then coherence. Okay, let's focus on adequate development. The topic that the paragraph, each and every paragraph, deals with should be discussed and fully and adequately in the paragraph unpacked. What this means is that you should focus on unpacking the topic that's under investigation in that paragraph completely before moving on to another. Now, the entire paragraph should concern itself with a single focus. If it begins with one focus or major point of discussion, it should not end with another point of discussion. It should not wander between ideas within the paragraph. Lastly, there should be coherence in your paragraph. Coherence is that golden thread or logical line of argumentation that runs through your writing. It's very hard to build in coherence in your writing right at the beginning, but there's two ways to further or to better your coherence. The first thing is you have to read a lot of academic texts. The best way to learn how to write is to read. There's no shortcut there. However, there is a bit of a cheat way. And when you really just start out with writing academically, I always tell my students to make use of transitional expressions. And the reason for this is transitional expressions force you to build in coherence because it forces you to think how one sentence relates to the next and how one paragraph relates to the next. So let's look at some examples of transitional expressions. Okay, so transitional expressions are employed for different reasons. First, you can employ transitional expressions to show addition. So the transitional expressions that you might use are again, also, and then, besides, equally important, etc., etc. So you might have one topic that says the environment of an organization is important, and then you might say equally important is also, to show coherence between your first thought and your second thought. You might also compare. Then you might give examples or intensify the thought that you've been going on about. Then you might need transitional expressions to summarize, repeat, or conclude. Then you indicate place, not only physical place, but discussional place in saying above, adjacent to, below, further on the other side, on the other hand, etc. And then lastly, you might want to indicate cause and effect, and you might say accordingly, as a result, etc., etc. So transitional expressions are a good way to help you start off by being coherent if you aren't already in your writing. Okay, so paragraphs have to show adequate development, unity, and coherence. Let's move on now to look at the last aspect of writing up your literature review. And let's focus on answering the question about structure. Now, if you look at Tutorial Letter 101, you're going to see that we give you a few ideas around how a literature review is usually structured. You can structure it according to chronological order, from the general to the specific, contrast comparison, trend identification, methodological focus, problem cause solution, or topical order. Now, although any of these might be potentially suitable, the first two and the last one is used most often in studies at honors level. The chronological order from general to specific, or topical order. Okay, so that's a general overview of a literature review. I hope that this video helped you out. And start with your reading early. It really does take up more time than you think, but as you progress on it, it will become all the more fun, I promise you.